Section 7 of Selected Works of E. Boyd Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Our Country, Part 1, by E. Boyd Smith. Chapter 1. The Coming of the Norsemen, A.D. 1000. This is the story of our country, a story romantic and of high daring, the changing of the wilderness into a great and mighty nation. Its beginning was in the days of long ago. Out of the north, the frozen seas, the home of legend and mythology, came the Vikings. Restless adventurers, fearing nothing, they hung their war shields to the side of their boats and sailed forth into strange seas. From Iceland thus came Leif Erikson and his crew, the first white men to reach our country. The record they have left us is vague as it came down from the mouths of skalds, the bards, who sang history instead of writing it down as we do today. The Vikings, according to these songs, or sagas, came down our shores and landed at different places, perhaps as far south as what is now Rhode Island. They called the country Vinland. But they failed to make settlements as the natives, the red men, were hostile. So they went back again and left us only the legends of their travels. This same race of Vikings had already settled in a part of France from where, in time, they invaded and conquered England, and long later their descendants came back to our land as Englishmen. Thus, the first to come, at last they came to stay. The red men they first met were a savage people, with a copper-colored skin, black eyes, and long, straight, black hair. In summer they wore almost no clothing. In winter they covered themselves with the skins of wild animals they killed. They were fierce fighters, and lived mainly by hunting and fishing. They had settlements of bark houses, with holes in the top for the smoke of their fires to go through. They also planted and raised corn, pumpkins, and beans. Their tools and weapons were made of chipped or polished stone. The women did all the work. The men hunted, or fought with rival tribes. Here they were born, and of course this was their country. We will see later how, though they fought for it, they lost it, in the struggle with the strange white people who came from so far away across the sea. Their history mixes with ours, even from the coming of the Norsemen up to our own times. Chapter 2. Columbus discovers America, 1492. The next important figure in our story is an Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus. In his time, people did not have a very clear idea of the world and thought it flat, though some scholars said it was round. Columbus had made many voyages and heard many stories of strange, unknown lands, and came to believe that the world was round. He claimed that by sailing west into the great sea, he could, by a new route, reach India, a far eastern country which Europe traded with, and just then the Turks had shut off the way by the Mediterranean Sea. He needed ships and money, of course, and tried to get help from different governments. When almost discouraged, after many disappointments, Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain fitted him out with 3 ships and the men and supplies he needed. He, the first, had the courage to risk his life for his theory by sailing straight out into the unknown sea. It was a brave thing to do. Week after week he sailed, and no sight of land. His men became frightened and threatened to mutiny and turn back, but he managed to encourage them to keep on just a little longer, and at last land appeared. This was our country, and Spain had the glory of discovering it. Columbus landed on an island of the West Indies and set the flag of Spain. He thought he had reached India, and so called the natives Indians. They were immensely surprised to see these strange white men, the palefaces, as they named them. Columbus returned to Spain to tell of his discovery, and was received with great honor. Again he crossed to America, planting colonies, making several voyages, searching for gold, which he never found. Some of the leaders, out of jealousy, became enemies and laid false charges against him. They seized him and sent him back in chains, but the charges were disproved and he was set free in Spain. Columbus died without knowing that, though he had failed to find a short cut to India, he had discovered a new world, the American continent. And now the Spaniards, filled with the spirit of adventure, came pouring to America. Bold and daring, they explored the country far and near and made many settlements. Ponce de Leon, the new governor of Porto Rico, made a voyage to the mainland, and called the country Florida. Here, he had heard, was an enchanting spring which would make old men young. In those days people believed the most wonderful stories of this strange new land. He hunted far and long for this spring, but alas, never found it. Instead, he was attacked by the Indians and lost his life, which he had been so anxious to prolong. But he left us the name of Florida, now one of our states. Chapter 3. De Soto at the Mississippi, 1541. The discovery of this new world created a great excitement in the old world of Europe, and a host of explorers came to our shores. Among them was one Americus Vespucius, who wrote accounts of the new country. From this it became known as America, named after him instead of Columbia, which now seems a pity. Other countries were anxious to have their part, and enterprising explorers set forth. The Portuguese made voyages to South America and planted colonies there. The English sent out John Cabot, who also believed the world to be round, to find another passage to the Indies. He reached the northern coasts, Newfoundland and New England, and returned to tell of codfish in plenty. And soon, as early as 1504, the fishermen from France were to be found fishing from New England to Newfoundland. That fishing, thus begun so long ago, still continues today. Magellan, exploring for Spain, in the boldest and most astonishing voyage ever made, sailed around America by way of Cape Horn, through the Magellan Straits, and reached the Indies. And though he was killed in the Philippines, his ship kept on, the first to sail around the world, thus proving that the world was round, as the scholars had claimed. Meanwhile, a steady stream of hardy Spanish adventurers pushed their explorations, and claimed the country as their own. Many of these expeditions, after suffering great hardships, perished miserably, but others followed after, all in a wild search for gold. De Soto, a gallant knight, with a valiant army of some 600 men, with many horses, set forth from Havana. He landed in Florida, at Tampa. Here he rescued a Spaniard who had been for years among the Indians. This man, having learned their language, was later very useful as interpreter with the Indian tribes they met on their way. De Soto struck boldly into the wilderness, like others, in search of gold. As the Spaniards were cruel to the Indians, these furiously resisted his march, which became a long series of battles between the men in steel armor and the naked savages. Steadily his men perished in this fighting, but nothing daunted, he pushed on. The Indians in a night attack set fire to his camp, in the dead of winter, destroying much of his baggage and arms, which added greatly to the suffering of the company. But De Soto was too proud to turn back, as his men wished, and steadily marched ahead, to greater and greater hardships, always hoping for gold just ahead. At last he came to a mighty rushing river, which the Indians called the Mississippi, the father of waters. This, by right of discovery, he claimed for Spain, in the year 1541. Crossing the river, for another year he vainly wandered, then fell ill and died. His men, to hide his death from the Indians, wrapped him in his mantle, and at night dropped his body in the middle of the great river he had discovered. The survivors of what was once his bold army, after great suffering, with rudely built vessels, floated down the river to the Gulf, and at last, ragged and wretched, reached a Spanish settlement, after having lost half the army with which they had set out so valiantly 4 years before. Chapter 4. Pocahontas and Captain John Smith, 1607. Though Spain claimed all this newly discovered world as her own, and fast spread her colonies through the West Indies and along the Gulf shore, and far south, other nations also strove to gain a footing. France, by right of Verrazani's voyage of 1524, undertook to establish a settlement in northern Florida. This aroused the jealousy of the Spaniards, who fell upon the settlers and massacred them. In France there arose a cry of indignation. A gallant gentleman, Dominic de Gorges, to avenge his countrymen, mustered a company of men, sailed for Florida, and boldly attacked the Spaniards who had done this deed. He captured the fort and hanged the murderers, placing above them, for all to see, the inscription, not as to Spaniards, but as to traitors, robbers, and murderers. Next came the English, who made a settlement at Roanoke Island, 1585, under the leadership of Sir Walter Raleigh, who named the country thereabout Virginia. This colony soon perished and left no trace. At last a permanent footing was gained at Jamestown in 1607. Here, under the leadership of the doughty Captain John Smith, the colony gradually took root. They raised tobacco and Indian weed, and introduced the habit of smoking into Europe. Captain John Smith was energetic and made everybody work, though many, like the Spaniards, came hoping to find gold without work. The Indians caused trouble. Once they captured Captain John and were about to beat out his brains with their clubs, when Pocahontas, the young daughter of Chief Powhatan, seized his head in her arms and begged for his life. Powhatan spared Captain John, who lived with the Indians for a while, and arranged a treaty of peace with them, which was of great help to the colony. Pocahontas often came to Jamestown after this, and in time married one of the settlers, John Rolfe, and to this day there are people who claim to have descended from this generous Indian princess. Here, to Jamestown, in 1620, was brought a shipload of African negroes, who were sold to the planters as slaves. This was the beginning of an institution which later caused our country endless trouble. While this was happening, another great people, the French, was establishing a foothold in America. At St. Croix, in what is now Maine, in 1605, a settlement had been made. Then came a very gallant leader, Champlain, who founded Quebec in Canada in 1601. And Cartier, in 1534 to 1542, had explored this northern district. The French, unlike the English, made friends with the Indians, and so avoided much fighting. Champlain, in his exploration, discovered the lake in northern New York which still bears his name, Lake Champlain. Chapter 5. Samoset and the Pilgrims, 1621. In 1620 came another band of English settlers, this time to what is now New England. These were people who had left England some 10 years before and gone to Holland to find religious freedom. From Holland in time they sailed for America, in 2 ships, but only one completed the voyage, the Mayflower. Captain John Smith had explored the coast of New England and given names to its waters, a part he called Plymouth Bay. Here the Pilgrims, as they called themselves, landed. Before landing on board ship they drew up a form of government for themselves. This is the earliest written constitution known. They built rude houses and began to plant and make homes, suffering great hardships, which caused the death of more than half their number. But still they persisted. To them, one spring day, appeared a young Indian, Samoset, saying, "Welcome, Englishmen." Through his help they made friends with Massasoit and his tribe of red men. The Indians helped to feed the white strangers. They also showed them how to plant corn, using fish as manure, and hoeing and hilling. This was all new to the colonists, as they had never known our Indian corn before. All the Indian tribes were not friendly. Canonicus, the chief of the Narragansetts, sent a messenger with a bundle of arrows tied up with a snakeskin. This was a declaration of defiance. Governor Bradford stuffed the skin full of powder and bullets and sent it back, and Canonicus, who knew the power of the white man's guns, decided that as he could not frighten the Pilgrims, it was safer to leave them alone. Now, in 1630, another body of English, called Puritans, encouraged by the success of the Plymouth colony, came and laid the beginnings of Boston. And soon more colonists came pouring into New England and spread in every direction. They came to be free and independent, and planted that love of liberty which has made our country what it is. In 1635 to 1636, great numbers, with their wagons and household goods, left the Plymouth and Boston colonies and marched across the country into what is now Connecticut. Here they settled along the rivers and shores, as at Hartford and New Haven, founding new colonies with new governments. Though the Indians had at first been kind to the settlers, these, as they grew stronger, seemed to forget this, and were harsh and often unjust in their dealings with the red men, who, in their turn, became angry. They saw their hunting grounds being fast taken up by these strangers, and found themselves no longer free as before, and they began to fight, and wished to drive the white men from the land they naturally considered their own. Chapter 6. Roger Williams bringing the charter, 1644. The Pequots, a fierce tribe, and the ever-advancing settlers soon came to blows. There was murder and cruelty on both sides, and a bitter war began. The English, of course, had the great advantage of guns over bows and arrows. In the spring of 1637, they banded together and formed a small army, which suddenly attacked the Pequot stockade or fort. They hurled firebrands among the bark wigwams, which were soon ablaze, and shot down the Indians as they tried to escape, destroying the whole tribe. This ruthless fight is known as the Pequot Massacre. So terrible was this punishment that for a long time the Indians feared to oppose the white men. In the Massachusetts colony, though the Puritans had come to have freedom for their own religious views, they were not always willing to grant this freedom to others. Here Roger Williams took his stand for absolute religious freedom, claiming that each should decide for himself. But he was driven out of the colony as a radical, and fled in the dead of winter to the Indians, who took him in. He made friends with them, and even kept the Narragansetts from joining the Pequots in their war with the English. He gathered about him a band of followers, and crossed over into what is now Rhode Island. Here he founded Providence. In time he was sent to England to get a charter for his new colony. This he succeeded in obtaining, and gaining permission to land at Boston, he crossed Massachusetts to Rhode Island. Here, in 1644, as he reached the river boundary, the whole colony came out in canoes to welcome him home, and he crossed in triumph through the fleet to the new state he had created. He asserted the doctrine of intellectual liberty, and founded a state upon that principle, the first of modern legislatures to embody the principle of universal toleration in the constitution of a state. This is Rhode Island's glory. Liberty and independence was the great aim of the colonists who left their old homes to come to this new land, and Roger Williams is one of the most shining lights of this doctrine. He was just in his dealings with the Indians, and so made friends of them instead of enemies. Another good friend of the Indians was John Eliot, who tried to teach them his religion, though as a rule, like most people, they preferred their own. And though he had some success, most of the Indians were satisfied with their wild life, and grew resentful of the invading English. Chapter 7. The Dutch in Manhattan, 1664. While the English were thus firmly settling in New England, and the French in Canada, another people from Europe appeared on the scene. The Dutch, in 1609, had sent out an explorer, Henry Hudson, who discovered the Hudson River. Here soon came Dutch adventurers who traded with the Indians for furs. By 1614 they had made a settlement on Manhattan Island, now New York City, and before long they also made others up the river, as at Albany. They had also pushed east to Hartford. Here, however, they were finally crowded out by the inrushing English. Manhattan, then called New Amsterdam, grew to be a city, keeping pace with Boston. Here all creeds were tolerated, and people came from all parts of Europe, many English as well as others. In those days the governments of Europe often acted much as pirates, and thus, just when this Dutch town was thriving prosperously, the English took a notion they would like to have it. So, without any warning, in 1644, they sent over a fleet of warships with an army and seized the town, in spite of the indignation of the sturdy Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant. He was an old soldier who had lost a leg in the war. He wanted to fight for his town, but resistance was useless, as he had too few troops, so was forced to surrender. Later, in the course of a war with England, the Dutch regained the town, but finally, at the close of the war, recognizing that the English were too strong in America, they allowed it to go back to England. And so ended the Dutch colony in America. Though the settlers remained, and were absorbed by the steadily growing English, many of their names are still known in New York. The Spaniards, the French, and the English were busily reaching out to grasp as much of the great country as possible. There seemed to be room enough for all, yet we will see that in time they clashed and struggled, till at last the whole of our country fell under the sway of English rule. These last slowly but surely made settlements along the shore of the Atlantic, from Maine to Georgia. William Penn, a member of the Society of Friends, often called Quakers, who believed in the principle of friendship and honest dealing, came and founded Pennsylvania in 1681. He bought the land from the Indians, and so avoided savage wars. He named the first city Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. As the English pushed farther and farther south, they were opposed by the Spaniards, who, as first claimants, resisted their advances, and conflicts ensued. These conflicts even developed into wars, where first one side and then the other would attack. The Spaniards were settled in Florida, where they had built, in 1585, St. Augustine, the oldest town in our country. This state they held, though losing it for a time, to win it back again, till as late as 1819, when at last it became a part of the United States. Chapter 8. King Philip's War, 1675. We have seen that Samoset and Massasoit were friendly to the strangers in New England, but the colonists were not always considerate in their dealings with the red men, and frequent causes of friction arose. The Indians complained that the white man allowed his hogs to run free and destroy their cornfields. To protect themselves, they sometimes killed these hogs. Of course, the result was trouble. As the English kept coming and ever coming, they crowded the Indians back, took their old hunting grounds for farmland, and monopolized their fisheries. From the west, hostile tribes were threatening if they moved that way, till, little by little, they found themselves deprived of their broad acres and penned in by enemies on every side. Now they became desperate, and under their chief Philip, the son of Massasoit, they banded together and revolted, 1675. They rose in a frenzy to drive the white man from their land. Always cruel in war, they swooped down on villages at night, set fire to the houses, and murdered the inhabitants, as at Deerfield and other small towns. From Connecticut as far as the eastern border of Maine, they rose and waged ruthless war. A war which, with breaks, lasted over 20 years, until the Indians were practically wiped out. So desperate was this war that the life of the colonies was seriously endangered. Many towns were destroyed. The settlements of Maine were practically laid waste. The costs of the war equaled in value $500,000, an enormous sum for the few of that day. More than 600 men, chiefly young men, the hope of the colonists, perished in the field, and many women and children were killed as well. As many as 600 houses were burned. Of the able-bodied men in the colonies, 1 in every 20 fell. There was scarcely a family from which death had not laid toll. The colonists were forced to band together and raise armies. With an army of about 1,000 men, in the dead of winter, after an all-night's march through the snow, they surprised and attacked the fort of the Narragansetts, where some 3,000 Indians were assembled. The battle was desperate. Both sides fought furiously. The colonists rushed in, but the Indians rallied and drove them out. By now the Indians had many guns and knew how to use them. At last the white men succeeded in setting fire to the place. The fort was destroyed and the Indians overcome. More than a third perished. The rest were scattered, without food, to starve through the winter. The victory was dearly won, as it cost the colonists some 200 men. This was one of the most important battles of our history. It virtually ended the war. Soon after, King Philip was killed, and his son and wife captured and sold into slavery. A cruel fate for the grandson of Massasoit, the friend of the white man. And the day of the red man was nearing its end in New England. Chapter 9. La Salle descending the Mississippi, 1682. While the English in New England and along the coast generally came to make new homes, where they built towns and developed industries, the French, above in Canada, devoted themselves mainly to the fur trade, bartering with the Indians. This led them to stretch farther and farther west. They became hunters, trappers, coureurs de bois, and mixed with the Indians. This life made them adventurous and good explorers, opening up the New World, but it interfered with their taking hold of the land as solidly as did the English. These were fast forming a compact body of settlements along the Atlantic shore, while the French stretched out in a thin line over a vast territory. They have left us some splendid names of bold men, such as Champlain, Frontenac, and La Salle. La Salle dreamed the old dream of finding a passage to the South Seas, that is, a short cut to India and China. He began to push his explorations westward. He discovered the Ohio River. Hearing of a great river farther west, he determined to reach and explore it. He built a small ship, the Griffin, on the Niagara River, and sailed through Lakes Erie, Huron, and Michigan. Landing, he sent his ship back for supplies. He waited and waited, but the Griffin was never heard from again. Part of the way in canoes and part on foot, through 1,000 miles of snow-covered wilderness, he made his way back to Montreal. Beset by every form of peril and obstacle, pelted by snow, sleet, and rain, in danger of Indian attack, his men giving out one by one, till at last he alone was fit to travel. After 60 days of almost incessant toil, he at last reached his destination, to gather supplies and start back again. Such was the character of this indomitable man. He soon set out to try again. He had left his men building a ship, but they deserted while he was away. After a long search, he found Tonty, his faithful lieutenant, who had fled from the Indians. Now all his plans were upset, and he had to begin his work all over again. Indian wars also bothered him. He had to arrange alliances so that his party could get through. Again he had to go back to Montreal for help and supplies. The fates seemed opposed to him, but his courage and determination could not be daunted. By great effort he gathered together a company with the supplies necessary. They set out in canoes through the Great Lakes. Among his canoemen, strange to say, were Indians who had fought with King Philip. Driven out of New England, they were now to help this great explorer. They reached the headwaters of the Mississippi, and now at last La Salle began his exploration. He floated down this great river, the first white man, till he reached the Gulf of Mexico, but, as he saw, no short cut to India. He now returned to France to tell of his discovery, and proposed to the king to found a great colony on the Gulf and control all the vast West. He was given ships and men to start the colony, Louisiana, and sailed. Alas, fate seemed always bent on defeating him. He sailed too far, passed the mouth of the river, and landed far west, where, while searching for the river, he was murdered by some of his men. De Soto, who first discovered the great river, died miserably and was buried in its waters. La Salle, its explorer, met with an equally miserable end by the scene of his triumph. Both men were fated to lose their lives by the mighty river they had found for us. Chapter 10. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. The colonies of New England, in spite of Indian wars, steadily grew, and became prosperous and settled. They early established public schools for the general education of the people. The Pilgrims, who had lived in Holland, probably got this idea from the Dutch, who then were the most liberal and advanced people. They also got into the habit of forming their own government, and appointing all their own officers at their town meetings, where everyone had a right to vote. Thus they grew to be independent and democratic. Unfortunately, their peaceful development was often interrupted by war. England and France in rivalry were always squabbling, and whenever they went to war, their colonists were drawn into the fight, and each side incited the Indians to attack the other, finally joining in themselves. Thus, from 1690 to 1763, the English and French colonists were more or less steadily at war, till at last England sent a great fleet and army which overwhelmed the French, and Canada fell, fighting valiantly, and ever after remained an English province. In these wars Washington first appears. He led a Virginia regiment against French forts on the Ohio River. At this time also Franklin became known. Born in Boston in 1706, as a boy he worked as a printer on one of our earliest newspapers, which he delivered through the streets to the customers. During the last war he, the first, proposed a union of the colonies. And now the colonists began to feel their own strength. England had always treated them as if they existed only to make her rich, which they resented, and struggled against, with more or less success. Now she claimed the right to tax them. The colonies claimed that she had no such right, and bad feeling was aroused. 150 years of self-government had weakened their feeling of allegiance to the mother country. Born on the soil, as were their fathers and grandfathers before them, they were now Americans, and insisted on their natural right to govern themselves. Bold leaders arose, such as Samuel Adams in Boston and Patrick Henry in Virginia, denouncing the course of the English king, who was stubborn and insisted on new taxes. He also sent troops to Boston, which made matters worse. Things reached a crisis when he sent ships laden with tea, which he insisted they should buy. The citizens revolted, and on the night of December 17, 1773, disguised as Indians, they went aboard the ships and spilled the tea into the harbor. Thus began the Revolution, our great romantic epic, the war for independence, the beginning of a great change in the history of the world. The English government immediately punished Boston by closing its ports to all trade, seizing its government, and sending over more troops. The other colonies arose to the support of the city. South Carolina shipped rice to feed its citizens. Virginia sent flour. The first Continental Congress, at the invitation of Massachusetts, was held at Philadelphia by delegates from all the colonies. They drew up an address to the king and refused to trade with England until justice should be done them. They also passed a resolution that all America ought to support them, the Boston people, if force is attempted. Franklin, who took part, was sent to England in hopes of arranging a settlement. End of the story of our country, part 1.